Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to speak candidly about a phenomenon that has, in our age of sentimentality, been draped with a halo of moral virtue, the tendency to feel too much. Society has begun to regard excessive sensitivity as a form of nobility, a spiritual refinement that elevates one above the cold and callous. Yet, from the standpoint of psychoanalysis, such an individual is not exalted, but tormented, not illuminated, but haunted. The one who feels too much does not experience more of life. He merely suffers more of the unconscious. His sensitivity is not a gift of the gods, but a symptom of repression. Behind every tear that falls too easily, behind every heart that bleeds too readily for the world, there lurks an ancient wound, a forbidden desire, a buried scream of childhood that was never permitted to echo. I have long observed that those who describe themselves as empaths, those who claim to absorb the pain of others as if by some mysterious osmosis, are in truth entangled in the unending drama between the ego and superego. They are the victims of their own inner tribunal. The id demands expression its primal energies, its erotic currents, its raw appetite for life. Yet the superego, that moral watchman, installed by early parental authority, condemns such vitality as dangerous, shameful, or selfish. The result is a psyche that bleeds inwardly. The ego, caught between these opposing forces, seeks compromise through sublimation, transforming forbidden desire into compassion, aggression into sympathy, libido into altruism. But what is repressed does not vanish. It returns disguised, distorted, demanding to be felt. Thus, the individual who feels too much is often not feeling the world as it is, but reliving the unfinished emotions of the past, projected onto the present as though through a dream. Let us imagine, for example, a woman who cannot witness suffering without collapsing into tears. She feels, she says, everything. The pain of others invades her body. The sorrow of strangers becomes her own. We might admire her tenderness, yet beneath her compassion there lies an unconscious identification with her own long-repressed helplessness. Perhaps as a child she endured a home where anger or grief were forbidden, where her needs were met with silence or punishment, where love was conditional upon self-suppression. Her organism learned early that safety depended on perceiving the emotional weather of others, anticipating their moods, absorbing their tensions. Feeling too much became a survival mechanism, a form of psychic vigilance. What she calls empathy is, in truth, the child's watchful terror, the perpetual scanning of the environment for signs of danger or rejection. The adult sensitivity is the fossilized imprint of childhood anxiety. Her tears are the residue of a once forbidden rage, transformed into compassion so as not to provoke the wrath of those she depended upon. You see, the unconscious has a peculiar sense of justice. It refuses to forget. It refuses to forgive. It refuses to die. What is repressed is not erased. It is merely translated into another language, the language of symptoms, of dreams, of sensations. Those who feel too much often experience an excess of guilt, a sense that their existence is somehow responsible for the world's suffering. This, too, is the work of the superego. It whispers, you must atone, you must serve, you must save others to redeem yourself. Yet what crime has been committed? None, except that of being human, of desiring, of existing as a creature of flesh and impulse. The empath's torment is thus a disguised self-punishment, an unconscious penance for the forbidden joys of the id. They cannot allow themselves pleasure without imagining another's pain. Their morality has become the jailer of their instincts. When I speak of repression, I refer not merely to forgetting, but to the active exclusion of desire from consciousness. The person who feels too much has erected within himself a dam against instinctual life. But the energy of the libido is not content to be imprisoned. It seeps through cracks in the ego's defenses, flooding the psyche in disguised forms in anxiety, in hypersensitivity, in bodily tension. This flooding is mistaken for empathy. The nervous system trembles under the return of the repressed. It is not the suffering of others that overwhelms them, but their own. They are drowning not in the ocean of humanity, but in the waters of their own unacknowledged depths. Every external emotion resonates because it strikes an internal chord, long silenced. The dream offers a revealing analogy. In dreams, the repressed returns in disguise, the forbidden wish clothed in symbolic form. Likewise, in the waking life of the oversensitive individual, the repressed affect reappears projected onto the environment. A stranger's sadness awakens their own buried grief. Another's anger revives the child's terror of the father's voice. A friend's rejection opens the wound of the mother's distance. The external world becomes a stage upon which the unconscious reenacts its ancient dramas. The empath, believing he is attuned to others, is in truth attuned to his own ghosts. Each tear shed for the world is, in secret, a lament for the lost self. In clinical observation, such individuals exhibit a profound ambivalence toward their emotions. They crave connection, yet fear intimacy. Their empathy is often accompanied by fatigue, resentment, even unconscious hostility. The thanatos, the death instinct, lurks beneath their compassion, whispering of annihilation. For to feel endlessly is to court death by exhaustion. Their love, unbounded and indiscriminate, becomes self-destructive. The eros that once sought pleasure now sacrifices itself to the superego's commandment. Thou shalt not desire for thyself. Thus, beneath the saintly surface, one finds a masochistic core, an unconscious enjoyment of suffering, a repetition of the child's submission to parental authority. The moral purity of the empath conceals a secret eroticism, the pleasure of pain, the ecstasy of guilt. It is not my purpose to condemn sensitivity, but to reveal its psychic origins. The one who feels too much is not condemned to endless torment if he is willing to turn inward to face, rather than flee, the source of his pain. For only by confronting the unconscious can he reclaim what has been lost: his instinct, his spontaneity, his right to exist without apology. The task of psychoanalysis is to bring to light the hidden economy of the soul, to show that compassion without boundaries is but the shadow of repression without awareness. If the unconscious drive is denied expression, it will disguise itself as virtue, and virtue will become pathology. Consider the dream of a patient who came to me claiming that she could not bear the cruelty of the world. Night after night she dreamt of standing before an enormous wave, its crest gleaming like glass, about to crash upon her. She awoke, trembling, unable to breathe. Through analysis, it became clear that the wave represented her own repressed rage, the forbidden instinct to resist, to assert herself, to cry out against the injustices of her youth. She had redirected that rage into empathy, weeping for others what she could not weep for herself. The dream's terror was the terror of the repressed returning of the unconscious demanding recognition. Once she allowed herself to feel anger consciously, her compassion became freer, less suffocating. The wave receded, not because the sea grew calm, but because she learned to swim within it. This is the chilling truth. The one who feels too much is not blessed with greater love, but burdened with greater repression. Their heart is not open. It is overexposed, stripped of the protective boundaries that the ego must erect to mediate between impulse and reality. They have mistaken permeability for virtue. Yet, to live without psychic skin is to live in perpetual vulnerability. The ego must learn to differentiate between the self and the other, between empathy and identification. Without this distinction, compassion degenerates into chaos, and love becomes self-annihilation. You may protest that such analysis is cold, that it reduces the poetry of emotion to mechanisms of the mind, but psychoanalysis does not despise feeling. It seeks to liberate it from compulsion. The goal is not to extinguish emotion, but to render it conscious. True feeling arises not from the unconscious repetition of trauma, but from the reconciliation of instinct and morality, from the ego's capacity to hold both without collapse. The individual who learns to recognize the difference between genuine empathy and neurotic identification becomes capable of love that neither consumes nor enslaves. The path to such maturity is arduous. It requires dismantling the idealized image of oneself as savior or sufferer. It demands the courage to confront the primitive within the infant's cry for omnipotent love, the forbidden wish to dominate, the hatred of dependency. The empath's saintliness is often a defense against these darker impulses. But to integrate them is not to become evil, it is to become whole. Only when the libido is permitted to flow through its natural channels, neither repressed nor idealized, can the psyche achieve equilibrium. Feeling too much is, Len, not a mark of spiritual advancement, but of psychic imbalance. It reveals the fragile ego overwhelmed by the forces of the unconscious. To heal is to remember, to reclaim the forgotten origins of sensitivity, to forgive the child who had to feel everything because no one else would. The analyst's task is to guide this return to hold the mirror in which the patient may see that what he calls empathy is, in truth, his own reflection, distorted by the waters of repression. When he can bear to look without drowning, then, and only then, does he truly feel. You see, when one claims to feel excessively, what is truly being expressed is not the surplus of love, but the surplus of unresolved psychic material, an economy of the soul in which unspent energy seeks new channels of discharge. The organism is compelled to circulate its libidinal current. If it is forbidden to flow outward through instinctual gratification, it will seep through the cracks of the ego as emotional overflow. This flood is mistaken for empathy. It is not empathy. It is leakage. The psyche, unable to contain the pressure of its own repressed drives, spills its contents upon the external world, perceiving in others the pain that properly belongs to itself. Thus, excessive feeling is a misrecognition, a projection of one's inner landscape onto the faces of others. The empathic gaze is often a mirror turned outward. What it sees as suffering in the other is the reflection of its own unacknowledged sorrow. When I listened to patients who felt too much, I learned to attend not to their tears, but to their omissions, to the small silences between their words, the unspoken resentment behind their compassion, the envy hidden beneath their pity. For every overt sentiment conceals its repressed twin. The one who cannot bear another's suffering often harbors a secret hostility toward it. Their compassion is a defense mechanism, a disguise for the wish to escape their own helplessness. The unconscious does not operate in moral categories. It knows only energy, displacement, and satisfaction. Where the conscious ego preaches love, the unconscious may harbor hatred. Where the individual believes himself altruistic, the ID might be enacting its own satisfaction through masochistic self-sacrifice. The individual who always feels too much derives a peculiar pleasure from his suffering. It confirms his moral superiority. It preserves his identity as the one who cares when others cannot. In this, the superego is appeased. You have suffered, therefore you are good. Such moral economies are the architecture of neurosis. The superego demands virtue. The id demands pleasure. And the ego trembles between them like a mediator at war with both masters. In those who feel too much, the superego reigns with particular cruelty. It accuses, it condemns, it whispers, "You must not rest," while others suffer. This tyrant was born, of course, from the internalized parental voice. The mother's disappointment, the father's judgment. The child, dependent upon love for survival, learns to translate obedience into goodness, repression into worth. As an adult, this same pattern manifests as compulsive empathy, the inability to allow oneself peace while others weep. The old parental gaze has been resurrected within the psyche. The superego no longer needs the parent to speak. It has become the parent itself. Observe how this mechanism reveals itself in dreams. A patient dreams of wandering through a city in ruins, carrying a bowl of water that constantly spills, though she tries to offer it to the thirsty. The dream is transparent. The bowl is the ego. The water, her libidinal energy. The act of offering, her compulsion to give to others what she withholds from herself. Yet the bowl leaks. The ego cannot contain its own contents. No matter how she tries to serve others, she remains empty. Here, the dream exposes the futility of unbounded compassion. When one refuses self-nourishment, giving becomes a repetition of depletion. The unconscious exposes the moral lie that endless giving is virtue. It reveals that such giving conceals resentment, that beneath the apparent purity of altruism lies the infantile wish to be loved for one's sacrifice. In analysis, one learns to decode the symbolic grammar of emotion. Every feeling has an underside. Every compassion, its shadow. The patient who cannot stop helping others secretly desires to be helped. The one who feels everyone's pain harbors the wish that someone might finally feel theirs. Repression creates inversion. The forbidden desire returns in its opposite form. The ego, unable to tolerate the raw instinct of need, transforms it into its moralized counterpart, the need to give. Thus, the empath's virtue is the mask of dependency. Their selflessness is not freedom from desire, but desire in disguise. It is not wrong, it is tragic. For they spend their lives loving others in the hope that someone might unconsciously recognize their cry for love. I have said that the unconscious is timeless. It knows no difference between past and present. Therefore, the adult who feels too much is still, psychically, the child whose feelings were never met, the infant crying in the dark for a mother's return. What the conscious mind interprets as compassion for the suffering world is, in truth, a regression to that earliest scene of abandonment. Every face of sorrow becomes the face of the mother who did not hear. Every voice of pain, the echo of one's own unanswered call. The excessive feeler is trapped in the repetition compulsion, the endless restaging of the primal trauma in the hope that this time, the outcome will differ. The unconscious seeks mastery through repetition, but achieves only exhaustion. The analysis aims to interrupt this cycle, to transform compulsion into memory, to give the repressed effect a name, and thus release it from its haunting biotame. Do not mistake this for cynicism. To unmask the pathology of feeling is not to despise feeling itself. On the contrary, Psychoanalysis restores emotion to its rightful dignity by freeing it from distortion. When the repressed affect is integrated, the individual begins to feel accurately. Sensitivity becomes discernment. Empathy becomes understanding rather than fusion. The ego learns that to distinguish the self from the other is not cruelty but health. Love requires boundaries, or it dissolves into hysteria. The one who has reconciled his instincts no longer feels too much. He feels precisely enough. I once treated a young man who could not walk through the streets without trembling at the sight of beggars. He would empty his pockets into their hands and then return home in despair, convinced he had not done enough. In dreams, he was always pursued by faceless figures calling his name. When we examined his associations, the voice of one of these figures became that of his younger brother, who had died in childhood, while the patient had survived an illness. His compassion for the poor was not social conscience. It was guilt for having lived. He was, in essence, trying to resurrect his brother through perpetual self-punishment. His sensitivity was mourning misdirected. When he finally wept for the child he had been forbidden to mourn, his compulsive generosity subsided. He began to live, rather than atone. Thus we return to the central principle. To feel too much is not a sign of excess emotion, but of insufficient integration. The flood of affect is the symptom of a divided psyche. The ego, unable to mediate between instinct and morality, collapses beneath the tension, and the dam breaks. The work of analysis is to strengthen the ego, not to harden it, but to render it capable of bearing the force of instinct without denial. Only then can the soul cease oscillating between numbness and hysteria. The one who feels too much must learn to think their feeling to draw the unconscious into dialogue with reason. Otherwise, they are condemned to live as instruments played by forces they cannot see. It is a grave irony that those most admired for their empathy are often least capable of intimacy. They drown in others precisely because they have not individuated. Their feelings, though vast, are impersonal oceanic. As I once described the religious sentiment, they dissolve the boundaries of the self in the illusion of union, seeking in humanity the mother they lost. Yet, true relationship arises not from merging, but from meeting from two distinct beings encountering each other across the gulf of difference. To feel too much is to avoid this gulf, to flee the terror of separateness by dissolving into the other's emotion. But individuation, if I may borrow the term, my Swiss disciple prefers, demands solitude. One must endure one's own emotions without drowning, before one can truly accompany another's. The excess of feeling is therefore both rebellion and submission. Rebellion against the cold rationality of a world that represses emotion, and submission to the unexamined authority of the past that dictates how one must feel. The psychoanalytic cure is not to extinguish sensitivity, but to relocate it from compulsion to choice. To feel consciously is a creative act. To feel unconsciously is bondage. The person who feels too much lives in servitude to ghosts ancestral, parental, infantile. But when they bring their feeling into awareness, they cease to be the haunted and become the witness. And to witness one's own unconscious is the beginning of freedom. So I say to those who always feel too much, you are not cursed by emotion. You are burdened by memory. Your heart is the archive of unspoken histories. The tremor you mistake for empathy is the echo of forgotten cries. Do not glorify your suffering, analyze it. Do not sanctify your pain, translate it. The unconscious will not be appeased by tears. It demands understanding. Only when you allow yourself to know what you feel, not merely to feel what you cannot know, will you begin to perceive others as they are, rather than as screens for your projections. Until then, Every act of love will. It is in the nature of the unconscious to disguise its own operations. And nowhere is this deception more exquisite than in the moralization of instinct. Those who feel too much frequently drape their psychic conflict in the garments of virtue, their ceaseless sympathy, their self-denying tenderness, their insistence on caring beyond measure. All this, when examined under the analytic lens, reveals itself as a transformation of forbidden impulses into acceptable forms. It is a process I have called reaction formation, the conversion of an unconscious wish into its conscious opposite. The individual who professes universal compassion is often defending himself against the eruption of hostility. The one who cannot bear to see pain may be warding off an unconscious delight in cruelty. The soul, in its labyrinthine economy, does not abolish an instinct, it disguises it. What appears pure is often a symptom of repression. What appears noble is a distortion of the drive. Let us take as an example the impulse of aggression, which is as fundamental as the sexual instinct. In the psyche of the oversensitive, aggression cannot be admitted. To hate, to compete, to assert these are unthinkable. For the superego forbids them with moral ferocity, and yet the instinct persists. Unable to express itself outwardly, it turns inward. The empath becomes his own target, his own victim. His compassion is soaked with self-contempt. Each act of care conceals a blow turned against the self. He rescues others to silence the executioner within. The result is exhaustion, depression, and often psychosomatic illness, the body punishing itself for desires it never dared to express. The analyst soon recognizes this pattern. The more one proclaims love for the world, the more one secretly despises one's own unredeemed instincts. Such altruism, if left unanalyzed, culminates in martyrdom, the final union of moral virtue and unconscious self-destruction. In this we observe the subtle dance of Eros and Thanatos, the twin rulers of human destiny. Eros seeks union, connection, life. Thanatos seeks dissolution, rest, death. In those who feel too much, these instincts entwine. Their love becomes a vehicle for death, their care a slow self-erasure. They call it devotion, but the unconscious knows otherwise. It is a longing to cease existing as a separate being, to merge so completely with the other that one's boundaries vanish. What the religious mystic calls divine union, the analyst recognizes as regression, a return to the infantile state of fusion with the mother, before the trauma of separation. Excessive empathy is, at its core, a nostalgia for the womb. The soul longs to dissolve back into that primal warmth where no distinction existed between self and other, pleasure and pain. The tragedy is that this longing cannot be fulfilled without annihilation. Thus, the empath oscillates eternally between the desire to merge and the terror of losing oneself, between Eros and Thanatos, between life and the memory of non-existence. When I speak of childhood trauma, I do not refer merely to acts of violence or neglect, though these are often its outer garments. The true trauma lies in the child's first encounter with limitation, the realization that one's desires are not omnipotent, that love can be withdrawn, that the world exists beyond the mother's gaze. This primal disappointment leaves an indelible scar upon the psyche. The oversensitive adult continues to revolt against it, attempting to restore the illusion of omnipotent empathy, to feel everything, to heal everything, to bridge the gap between self and world that reality imposed. But every attempt to recreate this lost wholeness ends in frustration, for the boundary cannot be abolished without madness. The only true healing lies in acceptance, the mourning of omnipotence, To feel less is not apathy. It is maturity. In dreams, we often see this dynamic dramatized. A patient once described to me a recurring dream in which she wandered through a great cathedral flooded with light, hearing the cries of wounded animals echoing from the crypt below. She would descend, seeking to comfort them, only to find that the cries grew louder the more she tried to soothe. Upon waking, she felt both exhausted and guilty, as though she had failed in some moral duty. The interpretation was plain. The cathedral represented her moral ideal, the superego's edifice of virtue, while the crypt contained the repressed instinctual life, the wounded beasts of desire. Her attempts at compassion only awakened them further. For the unconscious does not wish to be comforted. It wishes to be acknowledged. The animals cried not for kindness, but for freedom. So long as she refused to descend into their darkness, her empathy would remain sterile, an endless self-soothing that never reached the source. Here lies the paradox of excessive feeling. It shields one from authentic emotion. The more the individual feels, the less he truly knows what he feels. He becomes intoxicated by affect without comprehension. His tears are automatic, his compassion reflexive. This is not love, but defense, a flood of affect to drown out the intolerable silence of introspection. The unconscious employs feeling as a veil to protect itself from discovery. It is easier to weep for others than to recall the forgotten moments of one's own helplessness. Thus, the one who feels too much becomes addicted to the very suffering he fears. He repeats it, not because he enjoys pain, but because pain is the only sensation that assures him he still exists. In the consulting room, I have witnessed the transformation that occurs when such a person begins to remember. The tears cease to be theatrical. They become specific. The vague compassion for humanity gives way to grief for one's own lost innocence. This is the moment analysis aims toward the point where feeling becomes knowledge. The flood recedes, and beneath it emerges the landscape of truth. Only then can the individual begin to love without compulsion, to give without depletion, to feel without drowning. We must not underestimate the resistance to such awareness. The psyche defends its illusions with cunning. To renounce excessive feeling is to renounce one's identity as the good, selfless one. It is to confront the possibility that one's virtue was built upon repression, that one's empathy was a mask for fear. The ego rebels, the superego thunders, and the patient accuses the analyst of cruelty. Yet this resistance is the threshold of freedom. The one who dares to question his own goodness begins, for the first time, to know himself. In the analytic process, it is not morality that saves, but honesty. What, then, becomes of the person who succeeds in this inner labor? He does not become indifferent. Rather, he becomes capable of distinction, of feeling without possession, of love without fusion. He recognizes that compassion is not an obligation, but an offering freely given. His empathy acquires texture and boundary. It no longer arises from guilt, but from understanding. He can endure the suffering of others without collapsing into it, for he no longer mistakes their pain for his own. The child within him has grown up. It no longer cries through the mouths of strangers. The unconscious, once a subterranean river bursting its banks, now flows into the conscious life as creativity, vitality, and authentic affection. This transformation is the true aim of psychoanalysis, to release the affect trapped in repression and to restore the ego's sovereignty. It is not enough to interpret dreams or trace symptoms to their infantile origins. The patient must live the insight. He must confront his longing for omnipotent empathy, and allow it to die. Only then can he love the world as it is imperfect, finite, other. To feel too much is to resist finitude. To feel rightly is to embrace it. I will tell you a secret that many find difficult to accept. Behind the compulsion to heal others lies the fantasy of possessing power over pain itself. It is the infant's dream of omnipotence disguised as benevolence. When this illusion is exposed, the individual may at first despair, for he sees that he cannot save the world. But from that despair arises a new form of strength, the capacity to endure reality without retreat into fantasy. He discovers that love does not require the erasure of boundaries but their recognition. The empath who ceases to identify with suffering discovers compassion that is not exhaustion but clarity. In the end, those who feel too much must learn that their sensitivity is not a curse to be eradicated, nor a virtue to be worshipped, but a language to be deciphered. Each surge of emotion is a message from the unconscious, a fragment of history seeking articulation. The analyst's task is to translate this language, to render the overwhelming intelligible. When the hidden meaning is spoken, the compulsion dissolves, and what remains is simple feeling, direct, human, unmasked. To arrive at such simplicity after a lifetime of excess is perhaps the greatest sophistication of all. There is a moment in every analysis, a subtle turning of the tide, when the patient begins to recognize that his suffering has meaning. Until then, he experiences his sensitivity as a curse imposed from without, as if fate or the cruelty of the world were to blame. But when he perceives that the origin of his feeling lies within, when he begins to see that what he calls the world's pain is in fact the echo of his own repressed affect, the entire axis of his existence shifts. He no longer lives merely as a passive vessel of emotion, but as the conscious interpreter of his own psychic drama. This is the birth of insight, and with it, the first breath of freedom. For the unconscious ceases to tyrannize only when it is understood. The one who feels too much, upon reaching this threshold, confronts an abyss. If my compassion was my defense, what remains when I let it go? Here lies the terror of analysis, the dismantling of one's cherished illusions. To abandon excessive feeling is to risk discovering the emptiness it concealed. But it is precisely through that emptiness that truth emerges. For beneath the storm of affect lies a stillness, not of indifference, but of clarity. In that stillness, one can distinguish genuine love from the compulsions of guilt, genuine empathy from the repetition of trauma. One begins to sense that emotion, stripped of its disguises, is not chaotic but ordered, not boundless but articulate. It speaks the language of the unconscious, a grammar of images, slips, symptoms, and dreams. And once translated into consciousness, it loses its tyranny. You must understand that the unconscious is not a mere repository of forgotten memories. It is the living matrix of desire. Every feeling is an expression of the drive's eros seeking connection, thanatos seeking release. The tragedy of the oversensitive lies in their attempt to deny one drive through the worship of the other. They embrace eros, so fervently love, union, compassion that they drive thanatos underground, only for it to reappear in the guise of fatigue, despair, and self-sacrifice. But eros cannot thrive without thanatos, nor thanatos without eros. Life depends upon their dynamic equilibrium. When the individual allows both to exist in awareness, acknowledging the instinct for love and the longing for rest, the will to create and the wish to surrender, he ceases to be their victim. He becomes their conductor. To feel too much is to be possessed by the orchestra. To analyze is to take up the baton. It is often said that psychoanalysis is a cold science, that it dissects what is sacred in the human heart. But this accusation misunderstands its aim. We do not seek to abolish feeling, but to rescue it from distortion. The analyst's detachment is not indifference, but reverence. A reverence for truth over illusion. It is only by observing, without collapsing, that one can lead another out of confusion. In the analytic encounter, we reenact the drama of infancy. The patient projects onto the analyst the figures of the past, the parent, the lover, the judge, and through transference, relives the original wounds. The analyst, by refusing to repeat the old script, offers a new possibility, the experience of being seen without being absorbed, understood without being possessed. This is the prototype of mature empathy, not fusion, but recognition. When the patient internalizes this new relation, he learns at last how to feel without drowning, how to love without erasing himself. To feel too much, then, is the residue of a relation that was never reciprocal. The oversensitive person has been condemned to play both roles at once, the sufferer and the savior, because no one was present to bear his pain when it first arose. He carries within him the unfulfilled dialogue of childhood. Every act of empathy is an unconscious attempt to continue that dialogue, to find the missing interlocutor. But the analytic process teaches him to become that interlocutor himself. By listening to his own unconscious, by interpreting rather than suppressing its language, he fulfills the task that once fell to the absent other. He becomes whole, not by finding someone who feels as he does, but by becoming conscious of the one within who always has. This awakening, though liberating, is not gentle. It demands the dismantling of cherished moral images. The patient must face that his selflessness contained resentment, that his compassion masked superiority, that his purity was born of fear. Yet only by admitting these uncomfortable truths can he integrate the split between ideal and instinct. The superego's tyranny dissolves when confronted with the honesty of the ego. Then, what was once repression becomes discernment. Morality ceases to be a chain and becomes a choice. The individual who once suffered from feeling too much now discovers the rare capacity to feel consciously, to know why he loves, why he grieves, why he forgives. His emotions, no longer chaotic, become instruments of understanding. Consider how different this state is from the original neurosis. The neurotic feels the world's suffering as his own because he cannot separate his inner reality from outer events. The liberated individual, by contrast, perceives both clearly. When he weeps, he knows whose tears he sheds. When he gives, he knows what within him is giving. This self-knowledge transforms even pain into meaning. He no longer needs to repress, for he no longer fears what he feels. In this way, psychoanalysis restores to humanity the possibility of mature emotion, an emotion not of sentimentality but of awareness, not of compulsion but of choice. And yet, I must confess, there remains a melancholy truth. Few complete this journey. The resistance to self-knowledge is immense. Most prefer the familiarity of their suffering to the uncertainty of freedom. They cling to their sensitivity as proof of virtue, too afraid that without it, they will be nothing. They do not realize that what they call feeling too much is precisely what prevents them from feeling at all. Their compassion becomes performance, their pain identity. To such souls, analysis appears threatening, for it strips them of their favorite disguise, the belief that their suffering ennobles them. But if they endure the nakedness that follows, They find that beneath the performance lies a simple, wordless humanity capable of joy, of anger, of tenderness without guilt. This is the essence of psychological maturity, the capacity to live without justification, to love without pretense, to suffer without shame. In the final analysis, and I mean this both clinically and philosophically, feeling too much is not a sin to be condemned, nor a virtue to be celebrated. It is a symptom, and like all symptoms, it is a message from the unconscious, begging for translation. It says, "See me, understand me. I am the form your forgotten desire has taken." To listen to that message is the work of psychoanalysis. To ignore it is the perpetuation of neurosis. The person who feels too much must learn to ask, whose feeling is this? What in me does it represent? What wish does it conceal? In asking, he begins to think his emotion, and thought, far from killing feeling, redeems it. Emotion that is thought becomes meaning. Emotion that is repressed becomes madness. Let me end with an image that often visits me in reflection. The psyche is like an ancient house, its upper rooms bright and inhabited, while beneath lie basements locked and forgotten. The one who feels too much has torn away the floors of his house. The darkness below floods upward, and he mistakes the torrent for truth. The analyst descends instead, candle in hand, to explore the lower chambers. There, amid dust and echoes, he finds not demons but children, fragments of self waiting to be acknowledged. When the patient joins him there, when he dares to meet his own buried life without fleeing, the flood subsides, the house becomes whole again, and feeling returns to its rightful place as a guest, not a tyrant. Thus, the chilling truth for those who always feel too much is this: you are not suffering from excess emotion, but from unintegrated memory. The unconscious has been speaking through your sensitivity, demanding to be heard. Do not silence it with sentimentality. Do not glorify your pain. Listen, translate, and in that translation, find freedom. When you no longer fear your inner world, you will cease to drown in the outer one. You will still feel deeply, passionately, but your feeling will be yours, not the world's projection upon your unhealed soul. And in that moment, at last, you will understand what it means not merely to feel, but to know.